This is a very special episode because 3 months ago, I did my best to try to actually interview Rose West face to face. First, I contacted the prison directly.
Bit of a weird one, but I'm a filmmaker and I'm making a documentary. I was just wondering who I need to speak to in order to possibly arrange a filmed interview with one of the inmates at the prison.
So, in regards to this, you'd have to write a letter into the governor.
Yeah.
Just obviously asking on how you'd go about it and if they can arrange for it to happen for you, and then they'll get back up, they'll either contact you or they'll get back to you in regards to how to go about it, okay?
So, not feeling too disheartened, I then contacted the governor, who then gave me the number to HQ and I gave them a ring.
So I contacted the actual location, but they said I had to talk to the governor, so I contacted Julia Spence, and it's an inmate at Newhall Prison for a documentary.
At Millhall?
Yeah.
Okay, and, which inmate was it?
Rose West.
Okay, I'll look into that and get back to you.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
Unfortunately, they never actually got back to me. So it wasn't until January, 2 months after I had started trying to arrange this, they did get back in touch, and it turns out I have to contact Rose West herself. So I filled in the little form and I made direct contact with Rose West to get permission to actually interview her, and yeah, she didn't want to talk to me. So that was 3 months trying to talk to this woman, only for her to have no interest in talking with us whatsoever. Let's find out why. Frederick West was born on September the 29th, 1941 in Muchmarkel, England, the first surviving child of his parents Walter West and Daisy Hill. They were a poor family of farm workers, his mother being overbearing and overprotective of her child, while his father was a strong disciplinarian. In 1946, Fred was now 5 years old, and the family moved to Moor Court Farm with Walter working as a milking herdsman. The cottage they lived in had no electricity, and they relied solely on a fireplace to keep themselves warm. By 1951, Fred was only 10 years old, and he already had 7 siblings, though 2 would sadly pass away. But Fred was always his mother's favourite. He didn't have many friends growing up, often being seen as a mama's boy, but he sought friendship amongst his many siblings instead. At a young age, Fred knew the duties of hard labour, as he and his siblings were given chores around the farm just to earn a living, but this also led to him gaining a habit of petty theft. Classmates described Fred as scruffy, dim, lethargic, and getting in trouble at school on a frequent basis. He wasn't very intelligent when it came to school, but he had a strong passion for woodwork and artwork. On November the 29th, 1953, when Fred was 12 years old, Rosemary Letts was born in Devon to William Letts and Daisy Fuller after a rather difficult pregnancy. The family were financially troubled, and much like Fred, they were quite large, Rose being the 5th of 7 children. Her mother suffered from depression and was given electroconvulsive therapy during the pregnancy, which may have caused prenatal injuries to her unborn daughter, leading to the events later in her life. She even received another electroconvulsive therapy session just a few days before Rose was born. It was around this time when Fred West claimed at the age of 12 to have been introduced to sex by his mother. He was encouraged to perform bestiality with the sheep on the farm. He also witnessed his father sexually abusing his sisters, which led to him growing up to believe that incest was perfectly normal. These claims, however, are dismissed by Fred's own brother Doug, who stated that these never happened and they were merely created inside Fred's own sick fantasy and imagination. I can sit here and tell you that it's not true. None of us were ever abused in any way by anybody. As far as Mum and Fred and Dad and animals, that was just fantasy by somebody. Fred also claimed that his thirst for blood came at an early age, when he slit the throat of a pig, but his brother also denies this claim. We all know what a fantasizer he is. He never killed a pig in his life. The bloke who used to kill the pigs worked with Dad on the farm and he used to do that. None of us touched any of that. In December 1956, Fred was now 15 years old when he left school to work as a labourer on the farm full-time. The following year, he and his brother John began hanging out at a youth club in Ledbury, where he would harass women and young girls. He saw the opposite sex as objects of pleasure that he could use whenever he wanted to. He would approach them and grope them against their will. If a woman accepted his advances, Fred only cared about his own sexual pleasure and never satisfied theirs. Not long after Fred turned 17 years old, he bought a motorcycle, and 2 months later he was involved in an accident which left him with a fractured skull, a broken arm and a broken leg. He was in a coma for 7 days and had to walk with a brace for several months afterwards. It was this incident that led to Fred gaining a phobia of hospitals, and they caused fits of rage inside of him. Just 2 years on and he would suffer another head injury when he assaulted a girl on a fire escape outside the youth club. The woman fought back and punched him, sending him falling down 2 flights of stairs. In 1960, Fred met Catherine Costello, who went by the name Rena, in a dance hall, and they soon began dating. This was, however, short-lived, as she returned to Scotland after a few months, and the relationship ended. In June 1961, Fred was about to turn 20 years old when his 13-year-old sister Kitty informed their mother that he had been abusing her for 7 months and had even gotten her pregnant, though this pregnancy was terminated. Fred was arrested and he freely confessed to molesting young girls since his early teens and claimed that he thought everybody did it and that it was perfectly normal. Despite his mother being disgusted by his actions, she did want to defend him, but Kitty refused to testify and no charges could be pressed. It was at this point when the majority of Fred's family completely disowned him. He was banished from the home and he moved into a house owned by his aunt. It wasn't until the following year when he had patched up things with his parents, but the rest of his family still wanted nothing to do with him. Reports claim that Kitty's entire behaviour changed after this incident. She was a happy and friendly girl, but after the abuse at the hands of her brother, she became quiet and reclusive, staying away from anybody she could and always kept to herself, not trusting anyone. In September 1962, Fred met back up with his ex-girlfriend Rena and they even managed to rekindle their relationship. She was now pregnant by an Asian bus driver, but her family weren't satisfied with her bearing a mixed-race child, so she left Scotland and moved back to England to be with Fred. They got married on November the 17th, 1962, with his brother John being the only guest at the wedding. The newlywed couple lived in Fred's aunt's house for a short stint before relocating to Coatbridge, where he began work driving an ice cream van. Rena gave birth to her daughter Charmaine in March of 1963. The couple pretended that they had adopted her to explain the mixed race. The family then all moved back to Glasgow together. In July 1964, Rena gave birth to Fred's child Anne-Marie. They had a nanny, Isa McNeil, who described Rena as a considerate mother who was struggling to raise 2 children, while Fred treated their kids harshly. He allegedly kept the girls in the bottom of a bunk bed with bars fitted to the space between the bunks to cage them up, and they were only allowed out when he was at work. McNeil also had a 16-year-old friend, Anne McFall, who would also spend a lot of time at the household with them as well. Fred confessed to cheating on his wife several times in the early years of their marriage, and even having a child with another unknown woman. Upon discovering this, Rena also began to have an affair with a man named John McLaughlin. Fred actually walked in on one of their rendezvous and punched his wife in the face. McLaughlin then stepped in to attack Fred himself until he backed down. Regardless, Rena and John continued their affair, but he would often find her with bruises and black eyes, leading to him attacking Fred again. At one point, John witnessed Charmaine, who was only just older than a toddler at this point, asking her father for an ice cream, leading to Fred beating his child. Whenever things like this happened, John would always step in to assault him in return. On November the 4th, 1965, Fred accidentally hit a small boy with his ice cream van, killing him. but he was cleared of any wrongdoing by the police. Fred and his family relocated once again to Gloucester in a caravan, and Isa McNeil and Anne McFall would also join them before Fred found work as a lorry driver. By the time 1966 rolled around, Fred controlled all 3 women in their home. He would have frequent mood swings and would attack his wife or the nanny McNeil as well as his own stepdaughter. He began sexually abusing Charmaine and forced his wife to sell her body to make them some more money. It was now when Rena called John McLaughlin and asked for him to save the women and their children. However, during this time, Anne McFall had actually gained feelings for Fred, making their plan more difficult. Even more so when Fred promised to marry her. McNeil's boyfriend John Trotter was going to quietly escort them all back to Scotland to safety. But once at the meeting spot, McFall was really calm and asked to remain with Fred as the nanny for the children instead. It's believed that she had already informed him of the escape plan. John and Fred came to blows again, leading to the police being called. They all left west with McFall while Fred threatened to kill his wife if he ever saw her again. To ensure her daughter's safety, Rena frequently visited England to see them. She maintained her friendship with McFall for a while, but soon began to resent her actions. On October the 11th, she ended up stealing from Fred's caravan and was soon arrested and given 3 years probation. It was revealed at this point that Fred and McFall were now living together. She wrote several letters to her family about how Fred was the answer to making her life happy. In the summer of 1967, McFall was now 18 years old and 6 months pregnant with Fred's child when she completely disappeared. She wasn't even reported missing, but her dismembered remains were found near the edge of a cornfield, but not until June 1994, 27 years later. Her limbs were carefully disarticulated and many bones were removed. Her unborn child may also have been forcefully extracted from her womb. Fred denied murdering her for years, though he allegedly confessed to a visitor once arrested. The story was that they had an argument and he stabbed her to death. However, this doesn't add up, as her wrists were tied with a dressing gown cord, meaning that he would have bound her before murder, and it wasn't an act of rage. No forensic evidence could actually link Fred to the murder, but the state of her remains looked very similar to his later killings, leading most to believe that he was responsible. Just a month on, and Rena returned to live with Fred once again, and shockingly rekindled their relationship. However, the next year she left again, leaving the children in his care. With no nanny and no supervision, Fred often sent the children to social services. Meanwhile, elsewhere, as aforementioned Rosemary Letts grew into a teenager, she became moody and would often daydream, leading to her performing poorly at school. Her parents separated when she was in her teens, and she lived with her mother for 6 months before relocating to live with her dad in Gloucestershire. However, her father suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and would often beat or sexually assault Rose and her older sister Patricia. Once she hit puberty, Rose was fascinated by her body's developments and would often walk around the house naked, even with her younger brother around. She also began to molest her 9-year-old brother Graham, as well as her other younger brother Gordon. It was early 1969 when these two stories finally merged. Not long after Rose's 15th birthday, Fred was now 27 years old when they met at the Cheltenham bus station. Originally, Rose was disgusted at the sight of him, describing him as a tramp. However, over the following days, he showered her with attention that she really enjoyed. She rejected his advances for a date twice, but did allow him to walk her home. He discovered where Rose worked at the time, in a nearby bread shop, and managed to convince a stranger to give her a present from the man outside. After this, Fred entered the shop and asked her out on a date for a 3rd time, to which she accepted. The two started a relationship, with her visiting his home with his 2 children. At first, Rose treated the kids with love and affection, noticing that they were clearly neglected. She wanted them to take the girls for frequent days out together to treat them. Just weeks after first meeting Fred, Rose quit her job at the bread shop to look after his daughters full time. However, this was only on the agreement that Fred pay her enough for her parents to believe that she was still working at the shop. When he finally met them, they were mortified at his appearance, found him to be arrogant and a pathological liar. Rose's father even threatened Fred, vowing to inform social services if he continued their relationship. Despite being happy with him, at one point Rose did tell her parents that there's nothing he wouldn't do, including murder. Her mother just thought that her daughter was being dramatic. Little did they know that he most likely had already killed at this point. Both parents forbid this relationship to continue any further, but Rose ignored them. This led to them actually visiting social services to explain that their 15-year-old daughter was having a sexual relationship with a 27-year-old man, and that they had heard she was even engaging in prostitution in his caravan. Rose was taken away and put in a home for troubled teenagers in Cheltenham in August 1969. She was only allowed to leave under complete supervision. She would return home to visit her parents at the weekend, but would often sneak out to meet up with Fred. On her 16th birthday, she left the home and returned to her parents, while Fred was serving a 30-day sentence for theft and unpaid fines. Once he was released, Rose moved out of her parents' house into Fred's, who now lived in a flat in Cheltenham and had his children back from social services. Rose's father continued to try to put an end to this relationship to no avail, and in February 1970, she fell pregnant. She was put back into care but let out again on March the 6th on the promise that she terminate the pregnancy and return to her parents. However, she didn't stick to this and moved back in with Fred. She was now banned from ever stepping foot inside her parents' house again. 3 months on, and they left the flat and relocated to a 2-story house in Gloucester. On October the 17th, 1970, Rose gave birth to their daughter Heather Ann, though some speculate that Rose's father may have actually been responsible for this pregnancy and not Fred, but there's no evidence to support this claim. 2 months after the birth of his child, Fred was arrested for stealing car tyres and a vehicle tax disc. He was in prison for 6.5 months, while Rose looked after all 3 children. Charmaine and Anne-Marie were now told that they had to call Rose their mother. While the girls were in Rose's care, they were subject to countless cases of physical and emotional abuse. Anne-Marie would often break down crying and showed vulnerability in response to the abuse, whereas Charmaine wouldn't. She could get treated horribly, but she still refused to cry or show any signs of pain or sadness, which only angered Rose further. Charmaine always had hopes that her mother would come back to save them. She would often deliberately antagonize Rose, referring to her biological mother as her real mum, stating that she would never do such horrible things. Charmaine had a childhood friend who stated that she once came over to their home one day unannounced and walked in to see Charmaine completely naked, standing on a chair gagged with her hands tied behind her back by a belt, with Rose standing next to her holding a big wooden spoon. But despite this, Charmaine stood there completely calm and unfazed, while Anne-Marie was still in the doorway watching, with a blank expression on her face. On March the 28th, 1971, Charmaine was taken to hospital for a puncture wound to her left ankle. Rose claimed that it was merely an accident in the home. On June the 15th, not long before Fred was released from prison, he was visited by Rose, Charmaine, Heather and Anne-Marie. At some point after this visit, 8-year-old Charmaine West was murdered. That same childhood friend visited them one day in June, but was told by Rose,
"Charmaine has gone to live with her mother, and good riddance."
Furthermore, forensic analysis did confirm that the murder took place while Fred was still locked up. Rose told friends, neighbours and the school that Charmaine was picked up by her mother Rena to live with her in Bristol. Once Fred was released, he also reassured people that she was fine and with Rena. Once, Anne-Marie asked Fred why her mother would collect Charmaine but not her. He replied, "She wouldn't want you, love. You're the wrong colour." Charmaine's body was stored in the coal cellar, but once Fred was released from prison, he buried her in the yard near the back door of their home, but always denied that she was dismembered. Once discovered, it was determined that she had been severed at the hip, but this may have been caused by some building work that Fred had done on the property years later, accidentally damaging the remains underground. Several of Charmaine's bones were missing, leading to speculation that they were kept as souvenirs, but they were never found. Despite things between herself and Fred not working out, Rena always remained in contact with her children. It was August of 1971 when she actually visited Fred to ask where her daughter Charmaine was. She had become extremely depressed and anxious about her children's well-being at this point. She found Fred's address and demanded custody of their daughters, but this would be the final time that she would ever be seen alive. It's believed that she was intoxicated and then strangled in the back seat of Fred's Ford Popular. However, when her remains were discovered, a short piece of metal tubing was found, suggesting that she had also been restrained and sexually assaulted before she was killed. The corpse was then dismembered, put into plastic bags and buried near some trees, close to where Anne McFall was also disposed of. On January the 29th, 1972, Fred and Rose finally got married in Gloucester, with no friends or family being invited to the ceremony. Months later, Rose fell pregnant again when the family moved home to 25 Cromwell Street. Originally, it was a council property, but Fred soon bought it for £7,000. They converted the upper floor rooms into bedsits in order to rent them out for some extra money, and they installed an oven and a wash basin so the lodgers wouldn't need to enter the West family area downstairs. Only they were allowed access to the garden area as well. On June 1st, 1972, Rose gave birth to their second daughter, May June. Not long after, she began working as a prostitute, using the upstairs rooms of the building, and even advertising her services in local magazines. Furthermore, when people rented out the rooms, Rose often engaged in sexual activities with them as well, both male and female, as well as with Fred's own work colleagues. However, Rose always bragged that nobody, regardless of gender, could fully satisfy her sexual needs. Whilst engaging in sexual acts with a woman, she would sometimes suffocate them or insert increasingly larger sex toys inside them to cause more and more pain, and this would only excite her further. Fred would often join in, engaging in threesomes with many of her clients or the aforementioned lodgers or workmates. They collected bondage items for their sex lives and made it clear that they enjoyed the sexual dominance. They also had magazines and photographs portraying bestiality and child sexual abuse. The room that Rose used for her prostitution had a peephole for Fred to watch from afar, as well as a baby monitor for him to listen in from elsewhere in the house. In September of 1972, Rose and Fred took their 8-year-old daughter Anne-Marie down to their cellar, where they ordered her to undress. Anne-Marie was reluctant, leading to Rose tearing the dress off of her body. She was completely stripped and tied to a mattress before Fred raped his own 8-year-old daughter, while Rose watched and encouraged the whole thing. Afterwards, she said to her,
Everybody does it to every girl. It's a father's job. Don't worry, and don't say anything to anybody.
Anne-Marie claimed that after every incident like this, her parents treated her with so much love, kindness and affection, giving her bubble baths with soothing salts, seemingly as a reward. Fred and Rose continued these assaults and threatened physical abuse if they told anybody. Rose would also sexually abuse the children, sometimes making them do their chores whilst wearing sexual devices or revealing outfits. By the time Anne-Marie was 13 years old, they lied to people and said that she was 16 and forced her into prostitution. Rose would always make sure that she was in the room when her daughter engaged with her clients, so she wouldn't reveal her real age or what was truly going on. Around this time, when Anne-Marie was 13 or 14 years old, Rose took her to a bar and forced her to drink several glasses of wine. Fred picked them up hours later, and Anne-Marie was shoved in the back of his van and beaten by Rose, who said,
Do you think you could be my friend?
She was then sexually assaulted by her parents once again. Fred raped Anne-Marie more than 300 times, and he even ended up giving her syphilis. In October 1972, Fred and Rose hired 17-year-old nanny Caroline Owens. Owens had problems at home, so she actually moved in to live with the Wests and shared a room with Anne-Marie, who she immediately noticed was very withdrawn. Rose claimed that she was a masseuse, which explained why men would often visit the property. However, Owens then too became a victim of the West's sexual advances. She then decided that she was going to leave and return home. Fred and Rose knew the rough whereabouts of where she lived, as they had met Caroline when she was hitchhiking. So on December the 6th, 1972, they managed to lure her into their vehicle and apologized for their crude behavior, offering her a lift home. Caroline believed this to be sincere and agreed. Rose sat with her in the back seat, asking for a girls' chat while Fred drove. During this conversation, Rose began to fondle her, while Fred asked if she had had sex with her boyfriend recently. Owens began to object, to which Fred stopped the car, called her a bitch, and punched her unconscious. They then tied her up and gagged her. She was driven back to their home, where she was drugged, gagged again, and forced into a sexual assault from both of them. She began to scream, leading to Rose smothering her with a pillow before performing oral sex on her. At this point, Caroline gave up fighting and stopped resisting. Fred threatened to let his black friends abuse Caroline, and once finished, he'd bury her beneath the paving stones of Gloucester. He claimed that he had killed hundreds of girls, and she was only spared and brought to the house for Rose's sexual pleasure. She was then asked to return to work as their nanny, and seeing no other option, she agreed. However, later that same day, she and Rose went to a laundrette before Owens managed to make her escape and ran home. She was initially too embarrassed to tell her mother what happened, but she noticed all of the bruises leading to a confession. Fred later admitted that the plan was always to sexually torture and then murder Caroline Owens. Caroline's mother quickly called the police, and both Wests were arrested for assault, indecent assault, actual bodily harm, and rape. They went to trial on January the 12th, 1973, but now Caroline decided that she just couldn't bear to face the court, and all sexual abuse charges were dropped. The Wests pled guilty to the reduced charges and were simply fined £50 and were allowed to walk free. Once Owens discovered their punishment, she attempted suicide out of grief. Linda Goff was a 19-year-old local who attended a nearby private school. She became good friends with some of the people who would stay at the West's property, and it's believed that she even engaged in sexual activities with some of them. However, in April of 1973, Linda completely disappeared. Her remains were later found in what used to be a car inspection pit in a garage inside the house, which was since converted into a bathroom. Linda's mother visited the house to try to find her daughter and was greeted by Rose, who was wearing Linda's clothing, but she claimed that Linda had moved out of town to work somewhere else. That same year, Fred and Rose had their next child, Stephen. 15-year-old Carol Ann Cooper was living at the Pine Children's Home at the time. She was given permission to spend the weekend with her grandmother and did so. However, on November the 10th, 1973, she boarded the bus back to the home and was never seen alive again. Several extensive searches were administered, but nothing was found. Years later, her remains were discovered buried in the cellar of the West's household. It's believed that Fred and Rose may have picked her up hitchhiking before torturing and killing her. 21-year-old Lucy Partington lived in Bishop's Cleeve at the time, though she attended Exeter University. On December the 20th, 1973, she returned home for the Christmas holidays, but 2 days later she left her friend's house and disappeared. An extensive search was done, but like before, nothing was found. Her remains weren't discovered until years later, underneath the floor of the cellar in Fred and Rose's property. It's believed that she was waiting for a bus home before the Wests picked her up and murdered her. A week after Lucy went missing, Fred went to hospital with a serious laceration, which matched a cut found on Lucy's body. It's believed that he injured himself whilst dismembering the corpse. Her head was completely covered in tape, with a 3-inch rubber tube inserted to allow her to breathe. 21-year-old Therese Siegenthaler was from Switzerland, but was studying in London. It was during the Easter holidays of 1974 when she set out to hitchhike to Ireland to visit a friend, when she also went missing. She often bragged about her ability to hitchhike and claimed that she could look after herself, so no immediate concern was raised. However, once she failed to reach her destination, searches began to no avail. Her remains were also later discovered underneath the floor of the cellar in Fred and Rose's home. In August of 1974, an altercation led to Rose chasing Fred with a carving knife. Just as she lunged at him with it, Fred slammed the door shut, but this resulted in the knife being stuck in the door and slicing 3 of Rose's fingers, nearly completely severing them. She then calmly wrapped her hand in a towel and simply said,
"Look what you've done, fella. You've got to take me to the hospital now."
15-year-old Shirley Hubbard was undergoing work experience in the Worcester area at the time, but on November the 14th, 1974, she left work and was on her way home, but never made it there. No trace was found until years later, also being discovered underneath the floor of the cellar in the West's home. In April of 1975, 18-year-old Juanita Mott left her home and was headed for Gloucester, but she disappeared just a day before her friend was due to get married. This disappearance wasn't actually alerted to the police right away, but her family did contact the Missing Persons Bureau as well as the media. She would later be found underneath the cellar in Fred and Rose's home. By the time 1977 rolled around, Rose's father had learned to just accept their marriage and had begrudgingly grown to respect Fred. They actually opened up a cafe together named the Green Lantern, but it soon racked up debt and had to close down. That same year, Rose gave birth to yet another child, Tara. She often fell pregnant from other men, usually her clients, but they kept the baby and Fred would accept them as his own. To explain the difference of skin colour, he would often claim that his great-grandmother was black. In 1978, their next child, Louise, would follow. That same year, 18-year-old Shirley Robinson began to lodge in the West's household and even became lovers with Fred. She allegedly saw herself as Rose's replacement, which didn't sit well with her, who told Fred that Shirley had to go. It didn't help that, not long after, Shirley actually fell pregnant with Fred's child. She was 8 months gone with his baby when in May of 1978, Shirley Robinson completely disappeared. She was later found buried in the garden of their home. In 1979, Anne-Marie went to hospital for an ectopic pregnancy, but was soon discharged. However, she was brutally beaten by Rose for this, leading to her finally running away from home. Once Anne-Marie had left, Fred turned his sick desires towards his younger children, Heather and May, instead. He would molest them both and promised to break them in. May attempted to build a coping mechanism of laughing off the abuse. As they got older, Heather became a heavy drinker to try to cope with it, and because of her strange reaction to the abuse, Fred and Rose believed that she was gay and would constantly insult her, calling her a dyke. She would do her best to not shower at school, but if she was forced to, her classmates would notice that she was covered in bruises, but no investigation was ever done. As a child, May and Heather West would play dress-up in their mother's clothes, but unbeknownst to them at the time, it was actually the clothing of their victims. Alison Chambers was a 16-year-old girl, described as being quite a rebellious teenager at the time. She lived in the Gloucester area, but did frequently visit the Wests at their home. She was described as needing constant attention. Not long before her 17th birthday, in August 1979, Alison Chambers disappeared. Her remains would later be discovered in the garden of Fred and Rose West. In 1980, Rose had yet another child, Barry. 2 years on, and they welcomed Rosemary Jr. and their final one in 1983, Luciana. Some even believe that Fred and Rose disturbingly named her after their own murder victim, Lucy Partington. The children were always given chores and were rarely allowed out of the house to socialise. They always had to have one of their parents with them, and if they didn't follow the rules of the household, they would be punished, usually physically. However, this was mostly from Rose. Fred would sometimes hit them, but most of the time it was Rose doing the physical assault. Sometimes the abuse would be out of nowhere, and just for her own sick satisfaction, but she would always be very careful to not mark their faces or hands where people could see them. During the 20-year span between 1972 and 1992, the children were sent to hospital for injuries 31 times. The parents claimed that they were all simple accidents at home, and social services were never alerted. I had a couple of fights with Fred after I saw him attacking Rose with a kitchen knife. I decided to stick up for my sister and he took me outside and battered me. I remember every last detail and sickening moment of Fred. Thinking back, I can see the evil that was in him. I think my sister protected me from Fred. I'm lucky to be alive. I cannot understand why I was not disposed of during those years when so many others were. The only explanation is that Rose protected me. They would show me rooms once everything was finished and plastered up. I remember standing in the cellar downstairs after it had been renovated and thinking that it was out of the way and the kids could play there. Now I know what was around me. Bodies. The bodies of people I had met. Rose covered things up. Once I visited Cromwell Street and I had bought her and the kids chocolates. She invited me upstairs to a small kitchen and we talked. After an hour I said, would it be possible to go downstairs in the living room? I am family after all. I want to sit in your part of the house. Rose said it wasn't possible because they had closed off that part. I found it off and that proves to me that Fred was not the main power. She was as much involved in all of this as he was. She covered things up. Heather and Stephen ran away from home at one point, staying at friends' houses, but eventually returned and were beaten for leaving. One incident involved Stephen mopping the kitchen floor with a cloth when Rose walked by and accidentally stepped into the bowl he was using. She then hit him in the head with the bowl and kicked him in the chest, constantly yelling,
You did that on purpose, you little swine!
He was even told that he was going to have sex with his mother Rose once he turned 17. Another time showed Rose not being able to find a kitchen utensil, so she grabbed a knife and started attacking May June in the chest with it until her rib cage was covered with wounds. This was in front of her siblings, who could only stand and watch helplessly. Fred would also throw vacuum cleaners at his daughters if they ever tried to resist his advances. Tara was the child who received different treatment. She didn't get beaten by Fred or molested, but was rather spoiled. She claimed that it was because she wasn't his biological daughter, and he saw his natural kids as his own property, so he left her alone. Rose spoiled Tara, but still would sometimes hit her.
Mum used to hit me with a wooden spoon. I think she had too many kids and couldn't cope. It's not like we were hospitalised. She didn't break any of our bones, and Mum always made sure we went to the doctors, dentists, and were smartly turned out. She wasn't all bad.
May June was forced to watch pornography with her father, but she also claimed that she was assaulted by their Uncle John as well. Many believe that Fred's brother was fully aware of what was going on inside the house. May and Anne-Marie claim that John sexually abused them both multiple times when they were very young, which he strongly denied. In June 1987, their daughter Heather was 16 years old when she thought she would finally have a way out. She was hoping to get a cleaning job at a holiday camp in Torquay, but she was rejected. She cried all through the night. The next day, her siblings all went to school like normal, but once they returned, Heather was gone. Barry, who was just 7 years old, even claimed to have been there as Fred and Rose brutally beat his sister Heather to death right in front of him because she came home late. It was about 3 a.m. when I heard Heather coming in. I heard my dad shouting, "Where have you been? We've been waiting for you." I heard my mum slap her. Then I looked through the crack and saw my dad walk round behind her and put his leg out. Then he grabbed her neck and tripped her over. She went onto the floor. I could see her just a few feet away. Then my mum just booted her. She was kicking and kicking her and calling her a slag. My dad still had her by the throat. Then when he tried to get her to do things to him, she refused. I think that's why she ended up dead. My mum rubbed her hands together and said,
Right, let's clear this up.
I could hear my dad wrapping her in some plastic, and I could see my mum scrubbing the floor with a bucket and brush. There was some white bubbly stuff, which must have been soap. Mum was telling him to hurry up, and he asked her to help him, but she said,
I can't. I've got to get rid of this before the kids get up.
Fred claimed he didn't intend to kill her, but she mocked him, and he had to wipe the smirk off her face. Rose had told a neighbour that she and Heather had had an argument, suggesting that she may have initiated the death. Initially, May wanted to report her sister's disappearance to the police, but a dark look crossed Fred's face before he said, "You better not do that. You could get her into real trouble. You definitely don't want to go bringing the police into this." It's also been theorised that she was beginning to tell people about the abuse that took place inside the house. Her body was dismembered and then placed underneath the patio. To explain another disappearance, they told people that Heather left to work the job she had been rejected for, even faking a phone call from her to deter her siblings' suspicions. Though they later changed their story and claimed that she left to elope with a lesbian lover, and that she was also involved in some credit card fraud. If their other children did anything wrong, Fred would often say, "If you don't behave, you'll end up under the patio like Heather." In fact, Stephen was the one who dug her grave. He was told that it was for a fish pond by his father, having no idea that he was preparing his sister's final resting place. I was at a family meal at Cromwell Street, cooked by Rose. Heather kicked me under the table. She had a terrified, frightened look on her face. She was begging for help. I looked at her and remember thinking if something was wrong, she would be better off talking with her parents. Little did I know that they were the problem, and they had put the fear of God into her. I have a constant picture of Heather looking at me, begging for help. It still haunts me. I feel a lot of guilt and can't get over that. I had a feeling that something was wrong, but I never questioned their way of life. But that was the last time I saw Heather. On August the 6th, 1992, an anonymous tip accused Fred of raping his 13-year-old daughter 3 times, and he was arrested, as was Rose for child cruelty. However, like before, on June the 7th, 1993, their daughter refused to testify, and the charges were dropped. However, their children were finally taken from their care and placed in foster homes. This also sparked up an investigation regarding Heather, who had not been seen in 5 years. In addition to them now being arrested, the authorities put out word to try to contact Fred's ex-wife Rena and her daughter Charmaine, and they heard nothing back, sparking even more suspicion. While Stephen claimed that Fred was terrified of his own wife, other reports say the opposite. Fred wanted to do his absolute best to protect Rose, so he marched into a police station and confessed to murdering his own daughter Heather, hoping this would prevent the rest of the house from being searched and Rose being found complicit. Once more evidence was unearthed, Fred continued to protect his wife and confessed to all of them single-handedly. He even showed them where many more victims were buried and asked his son Stephen, "Look son, look after mum and sell the house. I've done something really bad. I want you to go to the papers and make as much money as you can." In court was the first time Fred and Rose had seen each other since the arrest, and the latter was described as being stone-faced and cold, which actually surprised her husband. Witnesses claim that Fred thought she would be desperate to see and embrace him for taking the full blame, but she instead seemed completely guilty and nervous. She never came near him. He looked at her the whole time they were in court. He tried to catch her eye and even tried to touch her at one point. She was unmoved. She had written him off. Due to this behaviour, once investigators asked Fred for more information on the murders, instead of his usual confessions, he suddenly began replying, "No comment," to everything. A search was administered on their home, where all of the aforementioned human remains and signs of torture were finally discovered. They were both promptly arrested in February of 1994. It was around this time when Fred actually confided in a friend, Janet Leach, that his wife had murdered his lover Shirley Robinson, and he helped dismember the body and remove the fetus. However, during the trial, Rose denied murdering anyone and claimed that her husband had committed all of these crimes alone. She denied participating in any capacity. She even claimed that she had attempted to stop one of the sexual assaults from taking place, and that she had no idea that her husband was murdering people. However, witnesses and evidence suggested otherwise, and she was prosecuted for 10 murders, including her own stepdaughter Charmaine. Fred was charged with an additional 2 murders before he had even met Rose. However, whilst on remand on January the 1st, 1995, Fred West committed suicide by hanging himself before he could go to trial. This death was a relief for many. My mum is a psychopath, and I was happy when my dad committed suicide, and now I think they should put my mum in a room with all the parents of the people she helped murdered so they can tear her to pieces. A suicide note was found with his body, requesting to be buried with his daughter Heather, who he had murdered years earlier. Well, Rose, it's your birthday on 29th of November 1994, and you will be 41 and still beautiful and still lovely, and I love you. We will always be in love. The most wonderful thing in my life was when I met you. Our love is so special to us. So love, keep your promises to me. You know what they are. Where we are put together forever and ever is up to you. We loved Heather, both of us. I would love Charmaine to be with Heather and Rena. You will always be Mrs. West all over the world. That is important to me and to you. I haven't got you a present, but all I have is my life. I will give it to you, my darling. When you are ready, come to me. I'll be waiting for you. In loving memory, Fred West, Rose West. Rest in peace where no shadow falls. In perfect peace, he waits for Rose, his wife. Upon discovering her husband's suicide, Rose allegedly seemed relieved to finally be free.
Rose was being charged for 10 murders. 2 counts of rape and indecent assault were dropped, despite the circumstantial evidence against her. On October the 3rd, her trial began, and she again denied all charges. An unnamed survivor who was abused by the duo back in 1977 actually described Rose as being the much more aggressive one out of the two. Caroline Owens did admit that her turning the Wests in got her £20,000 for her story, but she's been racked with guilt over it ever since, and now just wanted justice. Rose claimed that she was a victim of child abuse and rape, who naively married a violent and domineering man, and it was all just a terrible mistake. She claimed that she had never even met 6 of the victims, and didn't even remember much of the attack on Caroline Owens. She was shown photographs of the victims and asked if she recognized any of them. Rose went bright red and began to stumble and stutter, but denied knowing them.
And it's worth remembering that Charmaine West was murdered while Fred was still incarcerated.
She denied the claims of witnesses who stayed in their house, and claimed that she and Fred lived completely separate lives. She also claimed that Heather was a lesbian who assaulted her own siblings, but denied knowing what happened to her. She also maintained that she had phone conversations with her after she had left home. However, this contradicts Fred's own claims, where he confided in Janet Leach in great detail about him murdering Heather himself. Her fingernails were even found separate from her body, suggesting that she was tortured beforehand. He claimed that he strangled her in a fit of rage and then cut her up with a serrated knife. I cut her legs off with that, and I'm not telling you I've lived that a million times doing that since then. And then I cut her head off, and then I put her in the bin and put the lid on and rolled it down to the bottom of the garden behind the Wendy house. He later buried her remains and built a barbecue pit over it with a table where the family could eat over Heather's corpse. Furthermore, a long list of women came forward to claim that they were assaulted by a man who matched Fred's description between 1966 and 1975, but none mentioned a woman being involved, nor did they recognize Rose. Fred had also said himself, whilst being recorded, that Rose knew absolutely nothing about the murders, but he had also confided to Janet Leach that the plan was always for him to take full responsibility for all of the crimes, but in other conversations did confess to Rose murdering Charmaine as well as Robinson. After 7 weeks of compiling evidence, it was concluded that both parties were equally guilty of murder. On November the 21st and 22nd, 1995, Rose West was found guilty of 10 murders. She was given life imprisonment and would never be paroled. Rose did appeal the decision, as Fred himself had previously confessed to murdering 30 people himself single-handedly, but on March the 18th, 1996, this appeal was denied. She never bothered to appeal again, but still, to this day, maintains her innocence. Fred's brother John continued to be accused of participating in the assaults, murders and abuse. Janet Leach also claims that Fred himself admitted to her that John helped Rose slaughter people. He also claims that many more died and were buried on a farm somewhere, and only Rose knows where they are, but they have never been recovered. However, Fred has also been described as a pathological liar, so it's possible that these were all exaggerative lies. Regardless, John West was actually charged for rape, but on November the 28th, 1996, he was found dead after hanging himself before his trial could come to an end. I am very surprised that he has done what Fred did. I haven't seen John for 2 years, and I have not spoken to him since he phoned me on New Year's Day 1995 and he told me Fred had hanged himself. He was upset then, and I'm very surprised that he would do the same thing. In July 1997, Rose's brother Graham was arrested and sent to prison for 12 months for making a fake bomb call. A year on, and he was sent to a Birmingham mental hospital after taking an overdose. He was also suffering from psychological and post-traumatic stress disorder. Graham had previously laid concrete for Fred in the cellar, not realising that he was aiding him in his murderous plans. I'll be haunted to my dying day by the thought of what I did. I was told the cellar was being converted into rooms. I agreed to help as a favour. By the time we'd finished, the cement was about a foot deep. Now I know what was underneath, I feel sick. It's difficult all these years later to put into words the revulsion I feel. I keep thinking, my God, what have I done? My accidental role in it will haunt me until my dying day.
That same year, Fred's own cousin William Hill was also arrested for rape and indecent assault of a 15-year-old girl and sentenced to 4 years.
He was later sent to a mental health unit at Hereford County Hospital.
Their daughter Anne-Marie, who had run away years earlier, testified against her own parents,
though she did attempt suicide in 1999.
Stephen claimed that Fred was terrified of Rose, and he cut all contact with his mother in 1999, 4 years after she was convicted, all because of one single phone call. In 1999, she called me with hate and was blaming me for everything. She said I should have died when I was born and all that sort of stuff. It was a disgrace. My mum made my dad a minion who only wanted to please her in order to stay alive. He was terrified of her without a doubt. Right up to the point he died, he was terrified of her and what she could do. I'm not defending my dad, but I just want the full truth out there. My life was ruined by my twisted parents, but my dad had a softer side which I've never seen in my mum. It's hard for me to say this without someone jumping down my throat and saying, you are protecting your father, but I'm not protecting him at all. What he did was awful, and there is no doubt about that. She was the callous, the evil, spiteful, vindictive, manipulative person out of them. He was just a minion in a way. He just did what she wanted him to do. I'm not saying he didn't get any gratification from it. I'm sure he did, but basically the torture was driven by her. So I think that she was the driving force in the pair, and I feel that people don't really get that. They look at him and they think she was the controlled wife. This poor wife who was brought into this, but it wasn't that way at all. I know it wasn't. I was there. I saw it. I witnessed it. The way he was around her, he just wanted to please her. For years, her daughter May has tried to get a confession out of her, to no avail.
When Rose wrote to me from prison, her letters arrived every week and said she'd try to be a proper mum and tell me whatever I needed to know. I decided to ask her about Heather when I visited her, and I watched her squirm. I thought, she's not going to give me an honest answer for all of her promises, and she never has done. You never got straight answers. It makes it worse for the families of the victims because she's the only one alive who knows the truth, and yet she hasn't told it. I just wish she'd tell the truth to the authorities. Then we'd all know, wouldn't we?
Mae West grew up to have her own family, but really struggled when her daughter discovered the truth about her grandparents. This led to her being bullied at school, with her classmates even dressing as Fred and Rose West for Halloween. But Mae believes that there were many more victims than the ones we know about.
In the 1970s, I was really young. I knew we had tenants, and it was normal to see people come in and out. We thought Heather ran away. I used to think everything they did was strange. They would lock us up with a bucket at night, the light bulb taken out and the door locked. I don't know how they managed to do it, really. We didn't see any evidence of that at all. People ask me, do you think he stopped? And I don't think he did. I think he stopped using the house. Dad used to burst into my room while I was dressing, so I would wake up early to cover myself. Mum was way over the top for the littlest of things. She would say, I'm in the mood now, and would do you all. We had normal meal times, TV times. There was a lot of normality, but then there was that other side that wasn't. We saw terrible things. Sometimes he was funny, and we used to look forward to him coming from work. My son doesn't know who his grandparents are. He's never asked me. I thought it was strange. I thought he may have brought it up, but he hasn't. My daughter knows. She's never talked about it. She thinks, oh well, that's your background. Someone went as mum and dad to a fancy dress ball. She just said, Mum, you'll never guess someone went as your parents. They're criminals and evil, and that's what Halloween is. Sometimes I think when the criminals are sorted out, people overlook their families. I often see cases in the news and wonder, what happened to the children? My mum is in prison for life. She's been convicted of the murders of a child and 9 young women. One of them, my older sister Heather, and in a sense, she's protected. Sometimes I feel it's alright for her. She's had counselling, she's done a degree in English, every course she's been offered she's said yes to. She has a full life, hobbies, gym, sewing, cookery. She lives in a bubble. But what about us, her children? There's no place for us to be ourselves. I worry about people knowing or discovering who I am, and I have all these anxieties about my son finding out about his grandparents. My daughter is grown up now, and she knows and has dealt with it. She discovered her uncle's credit card has the name West on it, put 2 and 2 together and googled it. I wish she hadn't found out that way. And my son's coming up to 9 years old, and all the old fears are surfacing again. My strategy is to leave it. I won't tell him now. I want him to have a childhood that isn't marred. It's always a problem being part of the West family. I know I can't work with children, and it's about self-protection as much as anything, because if something happened to a child in my care, if they fail or hurt themselves, I'd be blamed because of my background. I thought about escaping my past once and going to Australia, but they wouldn't let me into the country because of what my parents did. And to think that they used to deport convicts from Britain. Once my husband applied to be a policeman, he couldn't get in, and I'm sure it's because he's married to me. We were overlooked by the authorities while our parents abused us sexually and physically as kids, and now as adults they say, "You're from an abusive family. We'll have to keep an eye on you."
In 1968, 15-year-old Mary Bastholm went missing, and it's believed that Fred may have been responsible, but to this day, no body has ever been discovered. Fred's son Stephen claims that his father bragged about committing the murder while he was on remand in prison in 1994, but this remains uncertain.
In January of 2002, Stephen West attempted suicide, but survived, and not long after he was arrested for having sex with a 14-year-old girl. Once caught, he claimed, "There's a bit of my dad in me." He had one of the most traumatic and distressing childhoods one can imagine, and what happened affected his emotional development. Anyone who has suffered like him has a tendency to remain emotionally less well developed for his age. In 2006, Fred's younger sister Kitty died after he also abused her so many years prior. Her cause of death isn't known to the public, but her husband stated, "The abuse from her brother, that's what killed my wife." I knew what he meant. The publicity of her brother's murder case, the attention of the police and people like me asking difficult, intimate questions. There was pain and suffering in the family long before Fred's murders were uncovered. Rose's brother Gordon spent years receiving endless threats and further abuse. He spent years being attacked, stabbed, had insults shouted at him in the street, and even bricks thrown through his window for what his sister had done. I hate her. When I was young we were quite close, but I've gone from loving her dearly to hating her. I was a kid back then. I remember I did look up to her. I couldn't stand Fred. I had a fight with him. He was strange. Would think, he works all day, comes home and works on the house. I'm done with talking. It doesn't do me any good. I've had enough. I can't sleep on the streets. What else have I got? They're shouting every night. I just can't take it anymore. I've just had enough. I can't take it anymore. It's never going to go away. It comes out through Google. People start talking and it's all rubbish.
On November the 8th, 2017, Rose's 39-year-old nephew Stephen Letts lured a 12-year-old girl back to his home before forcing her drugs and alcohol and then sexually abusing her. Over the years, Barry suffered psychological and traumatic issues as well as nightmares, leading to a severe drug addiction. On November the 1st, 2020, Barry died from a drug overdose. Tara, Louise, Rosemary Jr. and Luciana have remained out of the public eye and have probably changed their identities since.
Was it Fred's childhood that led him to a life of complete destruction? And was Fred responsible for Rose's actions? Are there more unknown victims out there that have yet to be discovered? And more importantly, was Rose aware of what her husband was doing? And if so, just how involved was she?
And was John West an accomplice to the duo who died before he could face responsibility for his actions?
Fred West committed suicide 27 years ago to escape, but Rose continues to rot in prison while the rest of the world remain
seeking answers.